A European settler state in the heart of Palestine, ruled over by religious zealots, fueled by Western arms. A Muslim world too divided to fight back. Does that sound familiar at all?
Yeah.
But this is not the story that you think it is, because this took place in the year 1099, when the Crusader army conquered Jerusalem, subjugating its population, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, for more than 88 years, before they lost it in a single day, when Saladin's army surrounded the city, crushed the Crusaders, and then opened Jerusalem to the world. So why did the Crusaders fail to build their everlasting kingdom in Jerusalem? And will Zionism meet the same fate? My guest today, political philosopher, Professor Roy Casagranda. Professor, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk to you about a lot of things, but what fascinates me about you as a teacher, as a communicator, is your ability to make history, even the driest parts of it, feel alive, feel like a political thriller that you're watching on Netflix. And I'm really curious as to where this desire, where this love of history and storytelling comes from for you.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I know the answer. When I was a kid, my father would tell me stories, mostly about his family and his own life. And I think I fell in love with stories in that moment. And then just it evolved into this love for history. Mm-hmm. You know, like, I love sci-fi. But at the end of the day, sci-fi has to have an element of realism, or fantasy. It has to have an element of realism. But history has no logic or rationale. It's completely insane, crazy. So it's the story that has no realism limits, strangely enough. And I think that's what's always fascinated me. Humans have no limit on how insane they can behave or how ignorant they can be.
Yeah, there's plenty of examples of that in history. Yeah. But it's interesting because you say that history has no rationality to it, and yet it's inherent in us as human beings to look to the past and look for patterns, and look for clues and look for guidance. What do you think that's about?
So I've always resisted this idea that history repeats itself, but the problem is it does. The moment in my head right now is 1933, and all my 1933 alarm bells are going off.
So I want to take you much further back than that. But then also we'll come back to the early 20th century and take a look at what was happening in the world at that moment. You have a very famous series of lectures on the history of the Crusades.
Yeah.
And it's about 6 hours long, and it's fascinating. There are so many colorful details and colorful figures that you go through along the way. When you look at the history of the Crusades that deeply, what does it tell you about the world that we live in today?
Yeah. One of the big lessons I think that is screaming at us in this moment is don't allow yourself to be pitted against one another. You have to work together as a group. If there's a common cause and a common interest, spending your time backstabbing your potential allies is probably a really big mistake. The other thing I think that stands out for me is religious fanaticism is going to create a bunch of suffering and misery and pain and death. And in that way, I think those are the two really big lessons that the world should be learning from those moments, but clearly isn't.
And I think when you think about religious fanaticism from a European perspective, the Crusades is kind of the hallmark of that, is where you have state power and religion marrying together to create a force that then tries to conquer other parts of the world. Where does that idea come from? Where does the driving force for the Crusades begin?
I think there's a couple of things going on during the Crusades, maybe more than a couple of things. One of them is unfortunately, the Vikings have become Christian, and Europe is trying to figure out a way to integrate them in, and it's not going well.
Right, because these guys are fighters.
They're fighters. They're fighters and they're merchants, and they're fishermen and they're dairy farmers, and they're trying to figure out how to integrate them, and they don't want to live in a cold environment anymore. The problem is there's still all this energy from their pagan raiding days, and Europe is trying to figure out a way to dispense with some of that. And one way to do that is to simply get a bunch of people to go on the Crusades. They don't all have to be Normans. They don't all have to be Vikings, but you want some, obviously. But it's like a pressure valve. You need to release it because there's too many nobles, there's too many knights, there's too many warriors. So that's one of the tensions going on. Another one is there was sort of a geographical envy. So when in the aftermath of the Prophet Muhammad's death, Abu Bakr launches an army into the Persian Empire, invades Palestine, and that army fighting the Persian Empire goes and conquers Syria. And it sets off a series of events that by the time we get to the year 711, at that point, the majority of what used to be the Roman Empire, and maybe not quite the majority in terms of like square kilometers, but about half, ended up under Muslim rule. And by population, though, it ruled over the majority of the world's Christians. And I think there was this moment where the rest of Europe felt like it had been severed from that chunk of Christendom and kind of always had this romanticism of how do we get some of that land back. So there was this drive that Christian Europeans had to take back that land. And Jerusalem got into the crosshairs because two things. One, the Roman Empire was falling apart and was being hammered by the Turks. And the Romans literally went to Rome because they didn't own Rome anymore. And which is, that's kind of embarrassing to be called the Roman Empire and you don't own Rome. And they asked the Roman Pope for help. And the Roman Pope said, we'll help you. And so in that moment, it framed what was happening with the Roman Empire as a religious war. And then the other part, once the religious war kicked in, the other part was, oh, well, if this is a religious war, we need to get Jerusalem because that's the holiest city in Christendom.
And was there a desire beforehand for Jerusalem, that Jerusalem needs to be Christian? Was that something that was already in the air and then this was the moment that galvanized it? Or was this kind of a spur of the moment thing?
No, I mean, because they wanted to frame it as a religious war, then Jerusalem had to become the centerpiece. The tragedy, I guess, historically in that moment too, was the Roman Empire was actually allied with the Fatimids, and the Fatimids ruled Egypt. The Fatimids and the Romans together hated the Seljuks, and they hated the Sultanate of Rum, which was in Anatolia, pushing the Romans back. And so they were working together as allies. And so as the Crusades are launching, the Fatimids actually took Jerusalem from the Seljuks.
Who were the Turks? Yeah.
So then the Crusaders arrive. They're technically faced off against their friend now because a friend of a friend is a friend, right? And then, of course, they don't care and they fight them anyway because in their mind, they're still Muslim. So who cares? It's worth pointing out that Christian pilgrims could go to Jerusalem anytime they wanted to. In fact, half the city was Christian. So there was no need to take the city if you wanted to go do a pilgrimage there. The city was never closed off to Christians.
Right, but it was more of a symbolic thing.
You're right. There was this sense of we should rule it because we're Christians and it's our holy city, as opposed to, you can go visit, you can go live there, like just whatever you want.
The Crusaders then gather this army and they start marching towards Jerusalem. What happens once they get there?
So when the Crusaders start, it's a mess. There's the first wave of Crusaders are actually peasants, and they're plundering Hungary, and the Hungarians actually put them down. And then as the Crusaders are showing up in the Roman Empire, the Roman Emperor, even though he asked for this, is like having to deal with these. They're it's not clear whether they're soldiers or brigands. They're sort of bordering on that line, and he's trying to get them out of the Roman Empire as quickly as he can. And when they get to Antioch, which is the first big city they conquer, when they take it, they set a precedent. And that precedent is they massacre the population within. And that becomes their their method of conquest.
Right.
And they kept doing that over and over again. And foolishly, people kept surrendering. You'd think after a while you'd learn the lesson. Well,
and they keep going, and then eventually they're taking one city after another, and that with this kind of terror that is probably preceding them.
Yes. So by the time they get to Jerusalem, they don't have siege equipment. They don't have any way to actually get into the city. So they surround the city. Jerusalem itself has springs in it. And then outside of it, it's arid, desolate. So it's really difficult to maintain a siege on it. That's why the city is the city that it is. And they even had little farm plots inside the city to supplement the stored food. So they can withstand a really long siege. The Crusaders surround it, and they begin negotiating with the Fatimid defenders, the Egyptian defenders, because they don't have the ability to capture the city through force. And then the Genovese show up, and the Genovese brought siege equipment.
And who are the Genovese?
Italy was a bunch of independent city-states, so Genoa in English, but Genova in Italian. It's on the, Italy is a boot. It's on the France side of the boot as opposed to the Adriatic side of the boot. And it was in competition with Venice for trade and trying to dominate the Mediterranean. And they show up with siege equipment and they haul it across land. And all of a sudden the Crusaders are in this fight in a serious way. And they attack and capture a section of the wall. They can't finish the job because the Egyptians were still holding on to the citadel.
The Fatimids, who were their allies at some point.
Well, yeah. And it was shocking to the Fatimids when the Crusaders start the siege, because they're like, no, I thought we were in this together. And so the Fatimids realize, oh, okay, we're being backstabbed. And so they put up a fight. I'm blanking out on the Egyptian general's name, but he ends up going to Ascalon and continuing the fight. So he's not surrendering because he's giving up. He's just surrendering for strategic purposes to save his men's lives and then continue the fight from Ascalon.
And so the Crusaders at this point, once the Fatimids leave the city, they enter Jerusalem. And then what happens?
They go to the Muslim and Jewish quarters and just begin slaughtering everybody. They're killing children. They're just murdering everybody. So many of the Jewish and Muslim inhabitants decide that if they're going to die, they might as well die in a place of worship praying. So the Jews go to synagogues, and a lot of Muslims go to the mosques, because, what else are you going to do? It's a desperate situation. You know you're going to die, but they're trying to figure out what to do. And in the Jewish quarter, the Christians piled wood around the synagogues and set them on fire and burned the people inside to death.
Wow.
In the Muslim quarter, they wanted to convert the mosques into churches. So their goal was to then break in and just slaughter the people inside, which is what they ultimately did. One of the Crusaders, his name is Tancred. He was a Norman from Italy. So he's a Viking. He's a Viking descent. He was one of those guys who was always looking for the edge and thinking out of the box, being innovative. He comes to Antioch and is there when the massacre takes place. And he stays with the army all the way to Jerusalem. He changes his mind about the massacring and begins trying to save Muslims. And at one point he comes upon a group of Muslims and he runs up to them and he says, "This is my banner." And he hands them the banner and he says, "If any Crusaders approach you, tell them that you're with me and that you're under my protection. I'm gonna go get more people and bring them to the banner. So just stay here and just tell them you're with me." So he goes to find more Muslims to bring to this, what he thinks is a safe spot. By the time he gets back, they're dead. The Crusaders murdered them. His banner is laying on the ground covered in blood. There was nothing, like he completely failed, but he gets proclaimed as the Prince of Galilee. And then Godfrey becomes the ruler of Jerusalem, but never takes the title king. And because in his mind, only Jesus could have been the king of Jerusalem. And he's the king because he was, for less than a year. He dies and he's replaced by Baldwin the First.
Does he become a king?
And he is crowned king.
Okay.
And
He's like,
becomes
I'm
the
taking
kingdom
crown.
of Jerusalem. And he's like, yeah, we're good. I'm obviously a king. And this is his way of also clarifying we're not part of the Roman Empire.
Right.
We are our own kingdom.
So they capture, they are successful, they get Jerusalem, this kingdom begins, and they separate themselves from the Roman Empire. They're not under the rulership of it. But then they have this brand new kingdom, and they obviously need to figure out how to survive.
Yeah.
How to arm themselves, how to make friends. They're in a new region, new part of town. What do?
Yeah, they have a problem. They don't have enough manpower and they don't have enough money. They don't have a navy. They don't have a basis for an economy. So they need to figure all this stuff out. And they just wiped out a potential labor force, right? So how do they make this work? And what they decide is forts. They need to build forts. As they're building these forts, they need labor. So they actually go, they take Christian Arabs and put them to work, but they also start bringing in Muslim Arabs and bringing them in as a cheap labor force. And so the irony is the Arabs are now building the structures that are designed to keep the Arabs from coming back in.
Right. That's not going to have any parallels down the line.
None whatsoever.
So what is happening in the region at the time? You mentioned that there was this rivalry between different Muslim empires, the Fatimids and the Seljuks, and they hated each other and they were competing over land, kind of part of how the Crusaders were able to kind of come in. And so I also think about where Jerusalem is and where Rome is, and the Crusaders have marched a long way to get there.
It's very long.
And they obviously, you have to think about supply lines and you have to think about all of these kinds of things. Does that become an issue for them now that they're in this fortress on one side of the map?
Yes, but they get help, and they get help from Venice. So Venice is jealous that Genova got in so early into the game. So the Venetians show up and they go, look, you need a navy. You need a navy to trade. You need a navy to move supplies and troops around. And the Fatimids have a big navy. You have no chance against them. It just so happens we have a navy. And the Crusaders sign on. And so instantaneously they have this already established, well-built navy that can rival the Fatimids. But there's a catch. Their favorite city on earth was Alexandria. So the Venetians, the Crusaders didn't understand this. The Venetians are willing to fight the Fatimids. They don't want to fight the Fatimids because Egypt is Venice's prize.
Right. They still want to go vacation there in the summer.
Exactly. The beaches are lovely.
I don't know if you've been. They're actually pretty stunning.
Yeah.
And then so the Crusaders have this external force that comes in and is able to kind of provide them with a navy that then secures them. And so does that mean that they're stable? Are they able to kind of sit back and say, okay, great, we've won the war? And
so there's lots of stuff going on. One of the problems that they have is they're not making it economically. So a lot of them resort to raiding, and the raiding supplements their income. And of course, it's infuriating their Muslim neighbors because the Muslim neighbors are like, look, you captured it, you've carved out your little state, be done with it.
Just calm down.
Just calm down. And they're like, no, we want to raid. The most famous of the raiders, of course, is Renaud de Chatillon. Renaud de Chatillon he was a special person. Like, he was in a category all unto himself. He became the ruler of Antioch, and he decided it would be really cool to attack Cyprus and plunder the island, pillage and burn it. And so he just went on a rampage, just tears the place up, goes back to Antioch. The Roman army shows up. Why? Cyprus belonged to the Roman Empire. On paper, he belongs to the Roman Empire. On paper, he's the governor of Antioch in the Roman Empire. And the Roman emperor's like, what did you do? I'm going to kill you.
They send the human resources manager and he's like, what are you doing?
What are you doing? And Renaud laid on the ground, just completely prostrates himself in front of the Roman emperor and begs him for mercy. And the Roman emperor gives him mercy for reasons I don't understand. And he continues on this rampage for a while, gets captured and ends up in prison for years. He's released and goes back to raiding and just terrorizing the area.
Right.
And to the point where he actually attempted to capture Medina. He sent a fleet into the Red Sea with the goal of landing near Yanbu and going inland until he got to Medina and sacking Medina. And his goal was to dig up the Prophet Muhammad's bones and bring them to Jerusalem.
Oh, wow.
And Saladin's brother, the governor of Egypt, discovers this, and he sends the Egyptian fleet from the Mediterranean through into the Red Sea. They hunt down the Crusader fleet, sink it, capture the Crusaders, and prevent the attack on Medina. On top of that, they kept invading Egypt. King Amalric invaded Egypt 5 times. Like, he was obsessed.
Right. And so at some point, the rest of the region starts talking about this kingdom and was like, something needs to be done. And so by the time that Saladin is in charge of Egypt and he's gathered this army and he's on his way, what creates this moment that, because I believe that there was several other attempts by other people to try and get Jerusalem back and they all fail and things don't quite work out. But what is happening in this moment that allows Saladin to succeed?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because Saladin does something nobody else could do, and he did it in such a way that it kind of stuck. It's the beginning of the end for the Crusader states. So Saladin is on accident the guy in that moment, right? He wasn't even a Turk; he was a Kurd. His uncle Shirkuh is one of the coolest names ever. Shir means lion, Ku is mountain. So his name is Lion Mountain. He was short, a little heavy set. He just wanted to fight. He was just a terrible.
He's like the complete inverse of what we think about when we think about Saladin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nuruddin, he's always dressed well. He's constantly going out of his way to talk about prayer, and he's modest. He doesn't refer to himself as Nuruddin. He loved Shirkuh, and Shirkuh talks him into sending soldiers on an expedition to Egypt. And, the conversation must have gone something like, Amr ibn al-As had 4,000 soldiers. You're only sending me with 2,000 soldiers. Like, it must have been some conversation. Like, how am I supposed to take Egypt from the Fatimids like this? Anyway, long story short, they do 3 expeditions. Shirkuh does 3 expeditions, and he drags Saladin along. Saladin didn't want to do any of them. He on the first one, he said, you could make me the Sultan of Egypt and I still wouldn't go. And Shirkuh goes, it's not a request. This is a order. And he drags Saladin along. And the third time, they not only defeat the Crusaders, they defeat the Fatimids. And Shirkuh becomes the wazir in the Fatimid state. And Shirkuh was wazir for 1 month. He died of tonsillitis, like the dumbest death ever for a warrior. And all of a sudden, Saladin is in this really weird position because he was still young. I think he was 30-something, 31. He's not very old. Yeah, I think he's 31. He doesn't have strong connections. He's a Kurd, so he's not well connected to the Turks. I mean, he has Turkish soldiers who like him and Turkish officers he works with. But all the Turks are thinking in the army, I'll just become the next wazir to replace Shirkuh. And there is a man in the Egyptian bureaucracy who went to Saladin and said, I'm going to use your weakness to get you the wazirship. And Saladin goes, what do you mean? I'm going to go in there and talk about how you don't have any connections. You're not well placed. You're too young. You don't have experience. And that's how I'm going to get you elected to become the next wazir, because everybody's going to think you're going to be easy to manipulate.
Right.
And Saladin goes,
so they're not going to conspire against you.
Yeah. And he goes, okay. And that's what happens. And that's how he becomes the wazir who replaces Shirkuh. And so all of a sudden, in that moment, this guy comes out of nowhere and is the top leader of Egypt. in a surprise. Everybody's shocked. Nuruddin's shocked. Everybody's shocked. King Amalric shocked. Amalric decides, I'm going to reinvade Egypt. And he does a 5th invasion of Egypt. And this time with Roman support, the Romans land. Saladin does an all-in gamble and tries to defend Damiette from being captured by the Romans and the Crusaders. He somehow succeeds, defends the city successfully. And he now is effectively the Sultan of Egypt. I mean, he can't take that title because technically Nuruddin should be the Sultan of Egypt because technically Saladin works for him. And so now there's this new weird tension. Who's in charge? Is it Saladin? Egypt is bigger than Syria, bigger economy, bigger population. He can raise a bigger army than Nuruddin's army. Why would he be subordinate? And in the next few years, there's this back and forth tension that keeps building between the two men. And then Nuruddin comes to believe that Saladin has rebelled against him and is about to order an army be formed to go invade Egypt. And by the way, they have to get through Crusader territory. So they're literally sneaking through Crusader territory to get back and forth between Egypt and Syria. And he's getting ready to form the army. He's told his officers, we're going to go invade Egypt. And he dies of tonsillitis.
What? You're kidding.
No. I think technically it was Quincy, but I don't know the difference between Quincy and tonsillitis. I don't know. Kills 2 of the greatest Muslim generals of the time period. And later, King Amalric, the Crusader king, dies. And all of a sudden, Saladin's facing this really crazy situation. His 2 rivals are dead. And the question he's asking is, do I attack the Crusader states while they're trying to figure out who the next leader is, while they're vulnerable, while they're weak?
Or do I go for Syria?
And one of the generals that he had been working with for years, there's a power struggle between Aleppo and Damascus. And that general controlled part of Damascus. He sends for Saladin and he says, I need your help in restoring order. We don't know who the next ruler of Syria should be. Nuruddin's son is too young and he's basically been kidnapped by a eunuch and taken to Aleppo. And so Saladin sneaks cavalry through Crusader territory, shows up in Damascus. Once he's got Damascus, it's just a matter of time before he takes over Syria. And so that's how he becomes the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. The next step is the step that I think is where Saladin proves to be a genius. I don't know what conversation he had in his head, so I'm just imagining. But there must have been a question of, why are the Crusaders doing this? How can I undermine their motive? And I think he concluded that the Crusaders were acting out of trauma. I'm speculating here. This is just me interpreting Saladin.
Tell me more.
He chooses a route of mercy. He wasn't doing it in the beginning. He wasn't ruthless. He wasn't like slaughtering prisoners or anything like that. But he goes one step beyond the normal limits of mercy. One of his first battles against the Crusaders, once he's the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, is a battle of Monkeyssad. Monkeyssad, that's where Renaud de Chatillon shows up. It's Baldwin IV, the leper king. He's too young. He doesn't have any experience. The leprosy isn't helping him any either. So he puts Renaud de Chatillon as the actual commander, and he'll be the symbolic commander.
And this is our rebel who tried to take Cyprus and failed.
Exactly. The murderer, rampage guy. He's literally just been freed from prison. And he takes command of this army. He destroys Saladin's army. Like, it is a humiliating rout. Saladin lost battles. He wasn't a military genius in the sense like he won every battle. And I think in the aftermath of that, he asked himself the question, what makes them such fanatics? Why are they so good in the battlefield? What can I do to undermine that? So as the conflict with they eventually make peace. He signs a peace deal with Baldwin IV, but Renaud can't help himself. And he begins raiding and attacking. He attacks pilgrims on the way to Mecca. He attacks merchant caravans. Eventually, he makes that fleet in Aqaba with the goal of capturing the Prophet Muhammad's bones. Like, this guy is operating on a sociopathic level.
He's out of control.
He's out of control. Baldwin IV, the poor guy, keeps trying to rein him in. He keeps telling him, we have a peace deal. Please, let's respect it. He can't. At one point, Saladin brings an army to besiege Kerak. While the siege is going on, so it's complicated. I don't want to get into the details. There's a wedding going on inside Kerak, and Renaud's wife takes some of the food from the wedding, leaves the fortress, walks out to the army, and like Saladin and his men are like, "What's happening?" And she's got servants carrying the food with her, right? And she walks right up to Saladin, and of course, in that moment, there's this crazy Crusader woman with food in her hands walking up to. She goes, "I brought you some food from the wedding. I hope to share it with you and your men. The honeymoon is going to take place in that tower there. When you're firing the artillery at the fortress, can you try to avoid the tower so that they can have a nice honeymoon?"
Oh, wow.
And Saladin accepts the food and orders his artillerymen not to fire at the tower and to focus on the other parts of the fortress.
What was that about?
I think it was a moment of humanity. It was a moment of, I can show kindness in this moment, and I lose nothing for that kindness. There was nothing that Baldwin IV could have done to stop him. And I think that's the moment, maybe, if not earlier, it's certainly right about there, where Saladin goes, what happens if I show the Crusaders consistent mercy? And I think he realized it would calm them down. It would, whatever the baggage that they were walking around with, that maybe this would bring them down a notch. By the way, the woman that's getting married is going to eventually become the Queen of Jerusalem.
Wow.
That's the long story I didn't want to get into, but like, it's really complicated. So, but it's fun because there's these weird moving parts.
Yeah.
So after Hattin, he talked the army into only executing the Turcopoles, the Knights Hospitallers, and the Knights Templars. The Turcopoles were Crusaders who fought using Turkish combat tactics, including horse archers. And then of course at Jerusalem he does another giant merciful event as well. And I think it's stuck in the mind of people like, if he's this merciful, how is he our real enemy? He's clearly not our real enemy.
And that's really interesting because then this becomes the legacy of Saladin that we remember, that, the canon of who this person was. And there are not a lot of people from that period of time that are remembered for being merciful and chivalrous. And it was a very bloody era.
Yeah. I mean, usually you enslaved your prisoners or killed your prisoners, because if you didn't kill them, what are you going to do? Free them? They're going to fight you again. And so there was this, you might ransom your prisoners because you'll get money for them at least. There was people didn't just free them. And Saladin was going and he was freeing them. And then the Third Crusade happens. There was a moment of unmercy. The Guy de Lusignan was the king of the Crusades when they were defeated at Hattin and then Jerusalem. But after Hattin, Renaud de Chatillon and Guy de Lusignan are brought before Saladin. And Saladin had ice water. And of course, it just broke Crusader minds. Like, how do you have ice water? And he hands the ice water to Guy de Lusignan. And Guy takes a drink. And then he hands it to Renaud de Chatillon. And Saladin said, I did not offer it to him. And then immediately draws his sword and kills Renaud on the spot. And the reason was, if you have a prisoner and you offer them water or food, you can't execute them. And he wanted to kill Renaud. So he quickly kills him on the spot so that he there's no confusion that there was no hospitality. And then, of course, Guy de Lusignan thinks, I'm next. And then Saladin's, no, you drank water that I offered you. You're safe. Kings don't kill kings, is what he told them.
Obviously, there's still another 100 years of crusades that happen. But this is kind of the moment when the Muslims regain control of Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think there is one more thing worth pointing out, and that is Richard the Lionheart shows up. And the most important piece is he eventually makes a peace treaty with Saladin and then leaves. And then Saladin dies after Richard left. But the peace treaty actually held for another 2.5 years after Saladin died. So, you can criticize Saladin and say he was too merciful or whatever. Even though the peace treaty only lasted 3 years, I think it was the end for the Crusades because they lost their edge, their fanatic edge. But it was because of Saladin's mercy. Because he told them, come to Jerusalem anytime you want. I will protect pilgrims to make sure that nobody gets harmed. You never needed to do this to begin with. And I think in that moment, a bunch of them went, yeah, why did we do this?
There would have been a lot more to galvanize around.
He was just this person trying to figure out a way to end this craziness and show people as much humility and dignity and grace as he could possibly muster. With exceptions like Renaud de Chatillon.
With exceptions. But then this is the record that we have of him. This is the caricature of this person that lasts for a long time. And the reason that he's so fascinating is that his image will get invoked over and over again in Muslim lore.
His eagles on flags.
Yeah. I mean, there's also that too. That's true.
And coats of arms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it deserves to be. He's inspiring. I mean, for so many reasons, but one of them is just his relentless mercy. Who does that? He didn't win by military genius. He won by being a human being.
And so forever he then becomes the benchmark that people in this part of the world imagine when they think of leadership.
Yeah.
And when they fantasize about a future leader that will come in and unite and then kind of trigger some of the same events that you read about in that part of history. And of course, nothing of significance happens for another 800 years. So we're just going to pretend nothing is happening in the world. But we arrive at this moment where Palestine and Jerusalem is back under Turkish rule, under the Ottoman Empire, which is at this point starting to wane. It's become the sick man of Europe.
Yeah.
The Western Europe, the empires, Britain and France, are kind of salivating. They're looking at it and they're maybe starting to scheme. But then there's this new idea that emerges around the late 1800s, which is Zionism.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? And why does the Christian part of Europe, these Christian leaders who really embrace it at some point and champion it and fund it, why does that relationship happen?
The founder of Zionism is a guy named Theodor Herzl. He was Jewish Austrian. And the I'm going to use this metaphor on purpose. The straw that breaks the camel's back is the Dreyfus affair. So Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army. And there is a security breach. Some classified material is leaked, and the French army needs to scapegoat somebody. It is clear Dreyfus had nothing to do with this. So they pick him, they try him, they find him guilty, and they send him off to prison in French Guiana. And Herzl goes, that's it. There's no place for Jews in Europe. We will never be treated as first-class citizens. But Herzl isn't wrong in the sense that up until that moment, there had been 800 years of pogroms. To commemorate, to celebrate, to inaugurate the Crusades, the Crusaders go along the Rhine River and attack the Jewish German communities that were living there. And then they went to the Middle East and began slaughtering
This
Muslims.
was a celebration.
This is how they inaugurated the Crusades. They went on a rampage and began murdering Jews. And then they went to Constantinople and eventually arrived in the Middle East. So in other words, when Herzl's talking, there had been 800 years of pogroms where anytime anything went wrong in Europe, the Jews did it. There's an inflation crisis, the Jews did it. There was a fire in the city, the Jews did it. And so he's not wrong in the sense that there is this history of persecution of Jews. I think the interesting thing to me is it was such a minor event. Like, don't get me wrong, it sucked for Dreyfus. But like when you compare it to all the other horrors that had happened to the Jewish communities up until that point, it's shocking that it was that moment that sort of broke this. What he said was the Jews need a place outside of Europe that they can go to and call a homeland. Once he created Zionism and it spread, everybody went, oh, it's got to be Palestine. That's where we're from originally. Let's go home. And so that's sort of the birth of it. Those guys went, that's genius. If we can figure out how to get you to Palestine, you're not in Europe anymore.
And these are the people in power at this point in Europe.
There's a bunch of people in power who are like this. There's a bunch of activists who aren't in power who are thinking all
and
those
they're
nonsense.
Christian.
They're Christian. And they're thinking, yeah, we don't want Jews in Europe. You're right. This is a great solution. We hate you and we can get rid of you. All we have to do is pretend we like you and we're trying to help you fulfill your goals. And so in that moment, anti-Semitism and Zionism have this really interesting wedding, and they have a common cause, which is the expulsion of the Jewish communities from Europe.
And this happens, of course, decades before the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich, and then ultimately the Holocaust.
Yes. And the Holocaust, in a way, is really just sort of like the last great pogrom. It gives you 850 years of just brutal mistreatment of the Jewish community in Europe. And by contrast, Jews were thriving in the Middle East under Arab rule, under Turkish rule. They were thriving in Persia. You know, the Jewish community in Isfahan had been there for how many 20, by the time that we get to Theodor Herzl, 25 centuries. And Saladin had two physicians who were Jewish. Maimonides, the great Maimonides, like, the greatest Jewish philosopher of the medieval period, and another Jewish physician named Ibn Jumay. The Kingdom of Granada at one point had a Jewish wazir. The Jewish community in the Middle East did great. The Jewish community in Europe was constantly persecuted in this terrible role. So in a way, it made sense to go to Palestine. I think the disconnect was, why would you go to Palestine to conquer it and then ethnically cleanse it and then create a Jewish-only state? That's I think, where the confusion sets in, right?
And at that point in time, is the idea of the crusade over? This idea that Christendom had a claim, especially, Europe had a claim to this land. Is that still alive?
It's still alive today. So there's two Maltas in the UN. There's the Malta that has a state and a government, and then there's the sovereign military order of Malta. That's the Crusaders. The Crusaders don't have a vote in the UN, but they have an observer in the UN. The Palestinians have an observer in the UN. Like there's this clear holding on to this dream, even though it was put down centuries ago. And then when World War I happens, Arabs rebel because they don't want to be under Ottoman rule anymore. And the British and the French cynically are using them because they had taken out a crayon and a napkin and then drawn a map of the Middle East and carved up the Ottoman Empire like a Thanksgiving Day turkey. And in the British mind, they were getting Palestine. King Richard had never taken Jerusalem. And so in a way, they saw this as, we're finally fulfilling Richard the Lionheart's dream and we're getting Jerusalem.
And I want you to really flesh this point out, because the Arabs rebel with the help of the British against the Ottomans.
Yeah.
And that's how the British get Palestine. And the Arabs think that they're getting independence out of this.
They lose. And so at that point, the Arabs are defeated and the French conquer Lebanon and Syria. And the French general in charge goes to Saladin's tomb and he kicks it. And he says, "We're back, Saladin."
Wow.
So at least in his mind, this was clearly
A
the
crusade.
Crusades.
Mm.
The French and the British were careful. No, we promise we're not doing it. Of course it's a crusade. What else would it be?
And then so Palestine becomes the British Mandate of Palestine. By this point, they've signed the Balfour Declaration, promising this piece of land essentially to European Jews.
So now there's this disconnect because the British are sort of playing both sides. But the British, they didn't want to lose Jerusalem. This is their dream come true. They had fulfilled Richard the Lionheart's dream. They were thinking that the British Empire, after World War II, it was clear they were going to lose India. But in their mind, I think they thought they were still going to hold on to parts of the empire. That, it was going to be dramatically reduced in size and power. But, Jerusalem wasn't too much to ask for. So they didn't want Israel to be created by any means. And of course, pretty soon, Jewish terrorist organizations begin committing acts of terrorism in Palestine because they're trying to break the British will to hold on to this place.
And when you look at these early Zionists, the especially the ones that ended up creating these organizations in Palestine, and their aim is to try and create this new Jewish state. What is that birth of the state look like?
So they know it's going to have to be violent. And the reason it's going to have to be violent is because, by the time we get to 1947, when the UN creates Israel by vote, when we get to that moment, the Zionists only owned 7% of Palestine. So they have a problem. They have legal deed of a fraction of what they want. The UN gives them 55% and then gives the Palestinians 45%. But the population is overwhelmingly Palestinian. So how do you make that work? And the answer is take a page out of the United States' playbook or the Crusades' playbook. That's part of what Israel is thinking. We can't have a large Arab population because they'll be they'll foment rebellion. So when they invade in 1948, the Deir Yassin massacre, that of course causes a panic event and Palestinians begin to flee. So the majority of the population in Gaza and the West Bank are actually refugees. They're internal refugees. They're not from there. They're from other parts of Palestine. And instead of Israel ending up with 55% of Palestine, it ended up with 78% because it literally carved another 23%, another quarter.
And those stories from places like Deir Yassin then becomes the horrific kind of lore that then spreads to other towns and cities, and Palestinians hear about it, and then they decide, do I want to stay and face whatever horror comes next, or do I want to leave? And so that I'm also thinking about some of the early conquests of the Crusades when they were using almost that terror to be able to help them gain ground.
Antioch and Ma'ara, for example, were both examples of that. So in that way, the two events are very much paralleled. Their European population coming in and ethnically cleansing it, using a large amount of violence. And I think what happened was the Arab world, the Palestinian population, but also everybody else, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, they couldn't comprehend the cruelty of what the Israeli plan was. They didn't get that the scale at which the Israelis were operating. It's unclear. But so one of the things that paralyzes the Arabs in that moment is shock. They're just shocked. Like, what's happening? And I think that's also what happened in the Crusades. The Arabs just couldn't believe the scale of the Crusader invasion, and they didn't know how to respond.
And I think there's something interesting too about the fact that the Zionist settlers that were there had just come out of 2 world wars, so they were pretty good soldiers. Like, they knew how to fight. And then that image of the Zionist as a fighter really becomes the core foundation of how the country sees itself as this almost kind of like a garrison state.
I mean, that's what the Crusades also saw themselves as too, right? They were an army without a land is basically what both Israel and the Crusader states were. And then they just took a land and suddenly they became something else. But that's still what Israel is, right? They can't get out of this need to constantly be at war, just like the Crusader states were stuck in that. And it's in part because they're an army. I mean, it's to the point where mandatory service for both men and women, they really are an army. And the Crusaders were just that. They were an army.
And now this is the moment in our conversation where I ask you to sort of like leap off the edge of history and look at the present moment and where we're at here, because there are a lot of parallels, and we've covered a lot of parallels. The state of Israel, when you look at the politics of the country, when you look at the way that it talks about itself, it talks about itself in very existential terms. It's still fighting for its survival. It feels like it's constantly under attack, that it has enemies all around it, and that is used to justify military campaigns and escalations. And I mean, when you look at it from a historical lens, where is this state, this very young state, at? How does it identify with itself in the region? Is it stable? Can it survive?
So I'm going to invoke another parallel, and it's obvious and beaten to death, but it's the best one we have, and it's South Africa. So the government that created apartheid was elected in 1948, and the first apartheid law went into effect in 49. Israel was created in 1948. Like, it's impossible to not notice that weirdness. What's strange about both states is it's post-World War II. So hasn't the world just learned about the cruelty of ethnic cleansing, for example, and this kind of apartheid state that is being created? And apparently the answer was, it's okay if you're white. And your victim is brown or black. It's not okay if your victim is white, right? Because how is what Israel did to Palestine any different than what Germany did to Poland? And I can't give you an answer because I don't see one. They look the same to me. So apartheid goes into effect, and before long, really by the 1960s, South Africa finds itself in this really big war. It's fighting in Namibia, it's fighting in Angola, it's fighting Zambia, and it's called the Boer War. It lasts 20 years, and it's this exhausting war. Well, that describes Israel really well. Israel has been stuck bombing Lebanon, bombing Syria for how many decades now, right? Israel invaded Lebanon in 78, withdrew, then invaded in 82, stayed until 2000, was finally driven out by Hezbollah, invaded again in 2006, invaded again in 2024. Like, they're just this repeat cycle, which is shockingly like the Crusades as well. Israel fought 3 wars against Egypt. It wasn't 5 like King Amalric did, but still, like, there's this Israel captured the Sinai and shut down the Suez Canal, and 16 years of Israeli occupation in the Sinai. So there's lots of these themes, these parallels that come in. What I'm hoping is that we're closing in on its 1987 moment, that we're closing in on its 1192 moment. So 1192 is when Richard and Saladin make a deal. By the way, Richard and Saladin never met. Saladin's brother did all the negotiating. 1987, the South African government began secret negotiations with the ANC. And it was because they realized they had reached a point where they couldn't go on. Part of that was that the United States had finally stopped funding the South African state. And without that flow of support from Europe, because Europe had done it earlier, and the United States, there was no way to sustain their model. They needed that European trade. They needed that European and American support. And I think there was kind of a birds of a feather thing, right? South Africa, Israel, United States.
They're settler colonies.
They're settler colonies. Yeah. They're designed to grind down the native population. So I think there was a lot of sympathy, but Reagan didn't want to give up on South Africa. We have him in a recorded telephone conversation with Nixon referring to Africans as monkeys. It's pretty clear that Reagan saw black people as subhuman. And so in his mind, white-ruled South Africa was the best path for South Africa. But the Republican Party finally told him there's no path to save South Africa. We might be heading in that direction in the United States.
Especially when you look at what's happening on the right right now in America.
Yeah, the right and then Hollywood, and like there's the Gen Z. There's all these places in which we're starting to see people go, why are we doing this? Why are we supporting Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people? We're also starting to see Israelis question that. There's been a large number of Israelis who have left Israel permanently, and they're only losing more. And then, of course, we've seen it with the Jewish community in the United States. They see it for what it is, and it's harmful to everybody. The Jewish people are going to have to live with this legacy forever, right? This history isn't going to disappear. It's not going to vanish. Like, I'm part German. My family left Austria in 1904. Like, we weren't part of the Holocaust. It doesn't matter. It still affects me. I still have shame as a part German for the fact that Germany did this Holocaust. This is something that you can't get rid of within a few generations. That type of damage and trauma was earned. The Jewish people were put through hell in Europe. The problem is they're acting on the trauma instead of dealing with the trauma. The hope I have is that the Israelis are going to get exhausted. They're going to stop getting the kind of support that they get from Germany and the United States, because Germany and the United States are the only reason Israel's still operating. If Germany and the United States simply had cut off support, Israel would be forced to the negotiation tables and they'd have to make a deal.
And this is an interesting point for us to draw our conversation to a close, is when you hear Israeli leadership, especially today, talk about why the West needs to support them. They use the language of a civilizational battle.
Yeah.
And they invoke this idea of a Judeo-Christian civilization.
Yeah.
And you've painted this picture that spans 1,000 years. And a large part of that, the Christians and the Jews were not on the same side.
And they're never on the same side. Even when there was a Roman Empire, the Romans were brutalizing the Jewish population.
What do you think of that idea of painting history in that way?
So, I mean, it's obvious that this Judeo-Christian idea came out of the Zionist movement to restructure history and religion in a way that would make sense to the average uneducated American, right? They'd be like, oh, yeah. The reality is that historically, Jews have always had a home in the Middle East. The creation of Israel created a catastrophic situation for those Jewish communities. There used to be a wonderful, massive, beautiful community in Morocco, another one in Iraq, another one in Yemen, another one in Egypt. And what Israel has actually successfully done, which is another tragedy, is destroyed those communities. I was in Morocco in 2018. And one of the things that I did was I went synagogue to synagogue because I wanted to actively mourn the loss of the Jewish Moroccan community. So my wife and I were going, we started in Casablanca and we ended up in Essaouira. We went to the Jewish quarter and we went to this larger synagogue, and the government had torn down the synagogue because it was collapsing. And then they built a brand new synagogue in its place. And we went to the top level because it's semi-museum, it's a functioning synagogue, but it has like a museum quality to it. And when we get up there, we see a woman, and she's the curator of the museum. And my wife asks, are you Jewish? And the woman says, no, I'm Muslim. And my wife says, you're the curator, right? And she goes, yes. And my wife says, why is the Moroccan government spending millions and millions of dollars maintaining these synagogues when the Jewish community is mostly gone? And the woman said, we're waiting for them to come home. There are Jews. They were taken from us. Morocco can never be whole until they come back. and we're waiting, and we're going to keep these synagogues operating. We're never going to give up on them.
Wow. Wow. What a really beautiful story to end on. Thank you for sharing that, Roy. It has been a pleasure to be able to speak to you and to hear you shed light on this shared history of ours, and all of the ways in which it intersects and overlaps, and the little things that come up again and again. And I every time there was like a little parallel that you brought up, I got so much joy out of hearing it. And it kind of takes me back to what you're saying in the beginning about, we don't want history to repeat itself, but we just can't help it. There's just something about us as human beings where we behave the same way in different scenarios.
It doesn't matter what technology we have, what language we're speaking, or what clothing we're wearing. We still keep doing these stupid things.
Roy Casagranda, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.